So for our panelists, I thought we would maybe start with defining some terms here, because I think that a lot of people, when they hear artificial intelligence, like a lot of different things come to mind. And I think the term just captures so many different things. So I wanted to just start by asking you, when you hear the term artificial intelligence in medicine, what comes to mind for you? And to what extent do you interact with AI in your day-to-day work? And maybe I would start with, just in the order you guys are on my screen, Roz, Jon, then Eric.
Well, I'm the one non-MD on the panel. I've got the useless kind of doctorate, the doctorate of science. But I'm super grateful to all the healthcare workers here. The AI that I actually work on building has had a evolving definition. I think it's been evolving faster than anything biological over the last few decades. What the founders of the field of AI called AI is very different than what we have now. And so I think the being a little bit flexible about it may be most useful right now, where we just refer to it as things that appear to be done very intelligently by machines, usually taking multiple complex inputs, a bit more than we can understand all at once, and producing some kind of a decision or action, diagnosis, or course of steps to be followed in response. Also, we work on AIs that do lots of kinds of detection of events and forecasting of events in my lab. And for example, I'm very excited. I got permission to mention this, even though it's not being public until tomorrow. For years, I had this nutty idea that I could look at my wrist and see if I might be able to tell the difference between if one night after you're working hard, you're just feeling run down, or if you're actually coming down with something. And now, with lots of physiological data and careful studies at Duke and Columbia and a lot of different partners on this, funded by DARPA and HHS, and hard work at Empatica, full disclosure, a spin out I have found, they've now got a fully running AI algorithm on a wearable that is highly sensitive and specific for telling if tomorrow you're likely to have a viral respiratory infection, such as influenza or COVID-19. And it just got CE medical approval, which is the European equivalent of the FDA. So this a crazy dream. Could an AI do this? To an algorithm, to now European acknowledgement that it works.
That is super cool. Jon?
Yeah, thanks. AI, I think, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So thank you for being thoughtful about naming definitions as a good starting point. When I think of AI, I think of it basically in two different tropes. The first trope is really just high-powered predictive analytics, as in the case of my practice, as applied to data sets that have incredible volumes of data. So for instance, like taking all the data inputs from an EKG and predicting an arrhythmia. Then I think there's more of a cultural trope for AI, on which we layer all sorts of potential hopes, dreams, expectations, and fantasies and worries. So you can think of it as sort of WandaVision medicine. And this more futuristic, perhaps still sci-fi orientation of the American imagination, that we could somehow engineer ourselves either to a utopian or dystopian future. And probably somewhere in the middle there is a sort of a somewhat more proximate possibility, captivated by what Christine Rosen, the cultural critic, would call techno-solutionism, where if we just have enough data and we just have enough smart people from Silicon Valley working on stuff, we'll solve society's problems. And so I think multiple tropes of the term get used, and often sloppily. So I'm glad we're talking about that.
Well, I think those are really good ways to define it. Caroline, I consider the subtype of AI of deep neural networks or deep learning to be the main thing of the day. And there it's taking big data sets as inputs. And typically we're talking about medical images, but it could certainly be speech and in the future more text, and getting outputs that interpret with machine support through the neural networks to really make the physician or clinician's life so much augmented, because it's basically seeing things, finding things, interpreting things that might not be picked up by human eyes, because, as Jon mentioned, there's such immense data. And that's just one part of the AI spectrum.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you guys, any of you who have thoughts about this, where in the medical spectrum right now you feel that AI is either the most mature or where it's growing the most rapidly. And I don't know if the answer to both parts of that question may be the same. When you think about diagnosis, treatment of any sort, or say drug development, do you have a sense of where AI has been applied the most, has matured the most? Is it sort of the same across the board, or has there been sort of one area of medicine where you feel, AI has advanced the most, or where alternatively there's been the most excitement lately?
Maybe I can start. I think we're still early in all of this. I think that's what, because of all the interest, the promise is in excess of the validation. But having said that, I think we have enough evidence with almost every specialty of medicine, whether it's radiology, ophthalmology, gastroenterology, pathology, dermatology. I mean, it's pretty striking how much machines can do to support clinicians. So, I think that part is really moving pretty quickly, and we're starting to see now, randomized trials, prospective trials. I think the other point that Jon brought up is about predicting. And there, it's not so much different from what we used to have before. It's like a machine learning, fancy analytics. And whether we're predicting better, I don't know. But the other thing that you touched on, Caroline, is drug discovery. And we have all these claims about these AI discovered drugs, but actually they're not so much discovered. There's one drug now for COVID that's been repurposed that was facilitated by AI, which is good, and actually has a EUA by the FDA used in conjunction with another repurposed drug. It wasn't AI catalyzed. And then we have 2 drugs or 3 that have been expedited through AI. So it's starting to make a big impact potentially. We don't have any drug that was truly, developed by AI that's out there in treating patients, but we do have, jumping through what could be considered 2 or 3 years in a matter of 2 or 3 months, that kind of thing. So I think we're making really good progress, but it's nothing like what a lot of expectations or assumptions are.
Roz, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I would like to add, I think the most stuff is happening where there's the most data and the opportunity to mine it and try to, do things like safety improvement, forecasting. There's also cases right now where the AI is running autonomously, making decisions and helping people today. And these are not as well known, but one of them came out of our lab and out of our company in Patica also. There's other things out there too that do automated detection of a medical event. For example, we automatically detect using multiple physiological signals if a person is having a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, if their patterns match those of generalized tonic-clonic seizures or grand mal seizures. Now, if you don't know about those, if you're having one, you're unconscious. So you can't call for help at that point. And actually the number 2 cause of all years of potential life lost of all neurological diseases is a thing called SUDEP that happens usually after a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. So it's the case that the death rate is a lot lower if somebody's there at that time. But right then when you're having one, you can't call for help. So the device actually detects if you're having one or thinks you're having one. If it's a false alarm, you can cancel it because you're conscious. If you're unconscious, it calls somebody on your care list. And hopefully they know to get there quickly. And then when the human is there, the device doesn't save your life, but the device summons the human who hopefully can give some first aid. And most seizures are not life-threatening, but in the case that you do stop breathing after one, it's significant to have somebody there helping give first aid. So that's a case where the AI is doing the real-time detection and monitoring constantly, right? Better than people do. In fact, it's much more accurate at detecting these events, more sensitive at detecting these events and recording them. But it's also higher on false alarms. People know false alarms. So the ideal optimal system here is the human with the AI working together.
Yeah. I wanted to ask one last big picture question here, which is, Roz, as you were talking and describing, the new system that you're working on, are you run down or just tired, or that it's so personalized to you. And same thing with the system that you were just talking about. My question is, with AI, do you think that most of the goals are driven towards more and more personalized medicine? And I know that, Eric, this is something that you think about a lot, versus, improving population health at a wide scale, because we have abilities to look at, large data sets broadly. And I'm curious, Jon, when you talk about this sort of like WandaVision, I often think about, health insurance companies, wanting to improve health across, their whole pool. Like for them, arguably, they want to see sort of broad volumes of patients improving. That's what's going to help their bottom line, as opposed to, single patients here and there. So I'm curious about your thoughts about AI's goals. Do you see them more and more being drilled down towards having, whether it's diagnostics or tools or treatments that increasingly help individuals, being sort of the dream, versus having, vast population health shifts, where we can sort of raise the bar for everyone somehow? What do you hear from the people you talk to?
I guess my response would be that it feels like a bit of a bait and switch, which is that it's sold as a personalization strategy, but then it's actually propagated within sort of the medical industrial complex as something that's going to be cost effective and efficient and scalable. And then the marketing of it sort of continues to say that it's personalized. Every generation has their new sort of fascinoma about how medicine is going to be revolutionized, including, evidence-based medicine, personalized medicine, embryonic stem cells, the Affordable Care Act, and all of these things have a place. It just seems to me that they're more incremental and their added value is a sliver. And to me, diagnostic uncertainty is a small part of the job of doing medicine. And I don't want to ask, I don't want to outsource touch to a robot, and I don't actually even want to outsource conversation. One of Roz's colleagues, Sherry Turkle, has written about reclaiming conversation, and I think that's the real exciting thing about what they're doing at MIT, is really infusing the humanity into technology. And I think that's what we should be focused on. But I guess I just worry that sometimes we sell it too hard as personalized, when in fact, the thing that's going to make it live or die has other drivers underneath it.
Eric or Roz, do you guys have thoughts about that?
I'm suddenly struck by the irony of the term personalized, because usually it just means that it's going to adapt its behavior to you, right? And we do that, for example, in our mental health forecasting machine learning algorithms right now, because it just gives better results. If we know that, for example, when you're having more social interaction, it might improve your mood, and somebody else, that much social interaction might decrease their mood. And these things are very individual, the kind of interaction, when it happens. What the algorithm can do is learn the patterns that are associated with certain predictions for certain people. But actually, there's no personal, there's no person, right, in the algorithm, in the thinking about you, in the caring about you when it does that. So it's really more just individual adaptation than person. To get really personalized, there still seems to be a need for a person. And it's interesting, like even when we've built chat systems, right? And we can craft the computer to sound empathetic, right? And people say, wow, it sounds like it really cares about me. And after a month of interacting with it 5 minutes a day, the working alliance inventory that's usually measured between a patient and a therapist or somebody, a coach, somebody who's helping you, the working alliance between you and the chat bot actually goes up, right? And shows bonding and caring and feeling cared for. And yet people know that it's just an algorithm generating it. And recently there was a really cool study Rob Morrison team did, published in JMIR, on, they gave the empathetic responses to people, told them in a randomized control trial that some of them were from the bot, and told them that others were from the peer. We've been trying to use the AI to bring peer responses to you, real human responses. And when people were told the same response that the human generated was actually from the bot, they didn't like it as much. They didn't think it was as good, even though the content was identical. So just knowing that it came from a real person gives it a real boost in the quality that you attribute to the response.
I just have a couple of things I'd add, Caroline, on this front. So I never have liked this term personalized, because that's like a monogram or something. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I like the term individualized, and I think it has a double entendre. That is, firstly, we talk about the clinicians getting benefit from AI, but actually another layer, dimension, which is equally as important, is the users, like what Roz has mentioned, whereby you can now, not in the US, but in other countries, you can get an AI kit at the pharmacy to determine whether you have a urinary tract infection accurately. You can diagnose whether your child has an ear infection without doctorless. And you can, get skin cancers and skin lesions diagnosed through algorithms. And, we have one FDA-approved deep learning algorithm, which is detecting atrial fibrillation from a smartwatch. So, there's another side for helping individuals with AI. Now, the other thing that's notable is that every one of us is unique. And so most of medicine is we treat everybody the same. If they have the same diagnosis, or we give them the same drug. And the point here is that we have the newfound potential that no human could do of assimilating all the data for a person at every layer, biologic layers, physiologic, anatomic, environmental, the whole shooting match, and giving them feedback as to how to prevent an illness they may be at high risk for, or better managing a condition that they already have. That, to me, is the real deal individualized medicine. We haven't gotten there yet, but we can see a path that we will get there eventually. So that is exciting. And, that I think is what's in store in the years ahead. The way medicine moves, it'll take a long time, but it's coming.
Yeah. So you guys have brought me straight into this topic that I wanted to talk about, which is what is replaceable or not replaceable in the clinical encounter, and what can be enhanced, and what you feel can't be enhanced. So just exactly what you were saying just now, Eric, there are AIs now that have been approved by the FDA, or that can maybe be even more accurate and do what a clinician can't do. I'm curious, Jon, as our clinician on board here, what if anything, would you say you would feel is missing? Like if you had a device that could tell a patient more accurately than, you know, a human could, that they have an infection or they have, you know, a certain condition, does that count as a clinical encounter to you? Or when would you be comfortable with saying they don't need a human interaction versus that's unacceptable to me to not have a human interface?
Sure.
Can you kind of talk through your thinking there?
I probably would have answered this differently a year ago, to be honest, because we've experienced such a catapulted transformation in telemedicine in healthcare, and there's a bigger chunk of telemedicine that I think works than I thought it would. So I'm just gonna be honest about that. I think and for the part that in which the cognitive burden of estimating risks of adverse outcomes, I don't think there's anybody arguing that we want the best tools in play, analytic tools in place to do that, to do it reliably, to do it transparently, and to do it with the kind of high quality, you know, output that we would expect, and maybe higher quality than humans can do. Because if it can't do it better than a human, it's harder to blame the machine at the end and hold the machine accountable, right? You have to hold their programmers accountable. So I think for the part of medicine that's diagnostics, great. I think there's no question. For the kind of patients I see, so last week I saw African-American mom, age 40, college graduate, 3 kids, 3 jobs, insomnia, chronic pain, taking care of a dad on dialysis. For that kind of patient, it's not clear to me exactly how much AI changes what I think I should do. And even if there was sort of a big Hero 6 kind of robot that could help me touch that patient even when I can't, then all of a sudden I'm missing out on learning from her and growing as a human being, even if it's slightly more convenient for her, and maybe she produces a scooch of oxytocin by having the machine touch her, and she has just as good a psychological states. I think the practice of medicine is still slightly impoverished in that circumstance. But of course, I might be wrong, because I probably was a bit of a curmudgeon about telemedicine, and it works pretty decent a lot of the time.
Yeah, Roz, as you have been inventing and you know, working on various products, how do you think about you know, building humanity or the human process into the things that you work on? Is this something that you guys have conversations about as you invent devices?
Yeah, my thinking also has changed a bunch on this over the years. You know, when I was first attracted to AI, everybody just wanted to like build the greatest machine that humans could build, right? And the human mind was the final frontier to build something as great as our mind. And the more I learned about the human mind, the more I learned about emotion. And then the more I learned about emotion, the more I learned about how people figure out what matters to them and how respecting that really matters. And when we build something that simulates what people do and gives them exactly the same input stimuli, but they don't respond the same way as when it's a real person, you have to respect that, right? That there's something different and unique that people have, that all the stuff we build, you know, even if the outputs textually are identical or visually are identical, that, you know, there's something missing there. We don't know how to build it all. It's very humbling the more we learn about what's, you know, what are humans. We're quite unique. And at the Media Lab, where I work most of the time, as picture behind me right now, I'm in my office at home right now, but there our focus is on building the kind of future that makes people's lives better. And yes, that means advancing a lot of AI, but advancing it not to make the biggest, baddest, strongest, most powerful AI on the planet, rather to think over and over about like what actually makes people's lives better, and then to build AIs that serve that purpose. So we've really kind of flipped it on its head over the last couple of decades. And it's really more thinking about extending human intelligence and extending human health and extending human capability and extending human empathy and compassion.
Yeah. And Eric, you have this whole book that's called How AI Can Make Healthcare Human Again. What were there any things that, you know, as you worked on that, you found surprising or unexpected as you were working on that topic that you hadn't expected as you started on that?
Well, I mean, really, Caroline, it was the impetus to do the book, which was, you know, the kind of Captain Obvious was, you know, we can make things more accurate because medicine is so inaccurate, shallow medicine, to rescue this field, which is notorious for not bonding the human bond. That is, when I was finishing up med school in the late 70s, which that defines me as an old dog now, but medicine was very different. It was a precious, intimate relationship between you and your doctor. And it was a very different look. And it happened over those decades, which I knew was that it had eroded that relationship, that human interaction, because it became a big business. And there are things like electronic health records and physicians and all clinicians being data clerks. And then there was, you know, these these units that you would basically be like billable hours for lawyers. And, you know, all this stuff was happening and it was destroying the relationship. And so what was the epiphany for me was, hey, you know what, we could get this back. And so that really was the reason, you know, I did the book. And it gave a chance to review what we can do with AI in the short term, but what we need to do with it in the longer term, which is restore humanity in medicine. And also what played a role was just as an experience, which I opened the book, which is, you know, going through a knee replacement, which was, you know, almost 5 years ago and still never, you know, properly recovered. But I was in touch with just devoid of empathy with the people that were caring for me. And I can't even use the word caring. So that's really, you know, firsthand experience adds to that as well.
Yeah. I'm sorry you went through that experience. My last question was just about bias and sort of, you know, we've heard a lot about bias being built into algorithms, whether intentionally or not. I guess my sort of two-part question here, because I don't want to presume either way. So have you guys seen any examples of bias, you know, in algorithms in medicine? Or conversely, are there ways that you think that algorithms can actually help prevent bias or lower bias and help you know, actually bring, you know, the principles of equity and help to enforce them in medicine?
I would say we probably don't even agree necessarily always on what equity looks like. And so enforcing them sounds a little dubious, but I think there's broad support for understanding what are the ethical means to move forward with new technologies. I'm thinking about the Asilomar principles and things like that, where large groups of thought leaders across the globe have kind of come together and tried to outline what those principles ought to look like. Getting there, of course, is a harder thing than just articulating them. And I think there are real challenges there. I also think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's hard to articulate the appropriate sort of ethics of the means when we can't articulate the ethics of the ends. So to me, the harder questions lie with the ethics of the ends, like what is this for? What's the meaning of medicine? How does our pursuit of incremental prediction quality fit with the overall goal of what medicine is supposed to be? And if we can't answer that question, then all of those questions about the means, to me, are super important. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient to answer the question of sort of how do you approach AI ethically.
I'm really hopeful because the algorithms are, well, sometimes they're hard for people to understand. They're transparent, right? You can run in a biased data set or an unbiased data set with different kinds of bias to find your flavor, and you can see exactly what happens. And that is really helpful, right? Whereas with a person or some other systems, you know, all bets are off, right? Whether they're acting in a biased way or not. So it's testable. In some cases, it's very transparent. And there's a whole lot of work in AI right now going on toward explainability and transparency. And I think with so many sharp people jumping on it, I'm very hopeful that the AI will be less biased in the kinds of ways we don't want to see. Although on that caveat, I want to just say it's all biased, right? There's always some kind of bias built in. The harder question, I think, are the ones Jon may be addressing, which is what are the outcomes we want? What are the optimality criteria that we are optimizing these for? We can optimize for all kinds of things, but what should we be optimizing for?
Yeah. I just want to remind, very quickly, remind all of our audience that, you know, we will be taking audience questions not too long from now, probably in about 10 minutes. So if you have questions, you can start putting them into Slido. But I do have just a couple more questions for you. So I don't know if I'm the average patient because I am a healthcare reporter. So I think I tend to ask a lot of questions to my doctors. And I like to ask, you know, how they've come to, you know, a diagnosis. I will ask them the mechanism of action of any drug that they're prescribing to me. I tend to ask a lot of, you know, nosy questions, but I do think that I like to know that my doctor understands what they are saying to me generally. So my question is, when we start to lean more on AI, how important do you think it is that a doctor understands what's sort of going on under the hood? And I also think about this as like a journalist who really is kind of obsessed with fact checking, right? So like how much, both from the standpoint of like being able to explain to a patient, you know, this is how we came to the decision either that, you know, you have this diagnosis or we're going to give you this treatment, you know, that goes beyond because the algorithm said so, but also from a trust standpoint, you know, like if I was a doctor, would I say like, I trust this just because, you know, some chief medical officer in my system decided that we're going to buy this software. Like to what degree does a doctor have to really understand in depth what is going on? How important do you think that is? Because I don't think in med schools are they going to be like, here's how you fact check the algorithm that you're going to depend on. So I'd love to just hear your guys' thoughts about, you know, the depth of understanding that clinicians should have, or how they can sort of come to terms with something that they may not be able to understand deeply. So,
well, I think this human in the loop story is really important, that you don't want to make any key decisions and just trust a neural network, an algorithm to, you know, basically lead to an automated diagnosis and then treatment. So that's why oversight is critical. And then that gets to your point, which is there should be familiarity with the nuances of AI. And that should be part of every medical school curriculum and training and postgraduate education. It hasn't started yet here, but it should, because we're already, you know, in the early phase of seeing these getting integrated in the care of patients. So kind of rule number one is you don't trust the AI implicitly. Like you want the facts checked. Well, yeah, same sort of thing. But on the other hand, you kind of touched on this another way, Caroline, which is the idea about the explainability. And I think, you know, when you got to a point earlier when you were saying, do we need to have all these algorithms fully explained? When you ask what's the mechanism of action of a drug, when we don't even know what the mechanism of action of many drugs are, okay? We have no idea. We don't have a clue, and we use them every day. So the point here is that, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be fully explainable. We're seeing more and more AI deconstruction of neural networks to use that as a reverse engineering to understand what's going on. But if you if you can't explain it and you don't understand what is going on inside this box, that's not a good thing. So we have to get education going in that regard.
I would think of this as sort of a chain of trust, where you've got this sort of the distal user, the patient, their family, et cetera. And you've got a practitioner with whom they interact in a health system and a really smart electronic medical record and a lot of expert recommender software doing stuff. But behind all that, there has to be a sort of, I would say, layers of sophistication and confidence that at each layer, the people to whom, say I as a practicing physician am just smart enough to understand what the sort of the AI output programmer people do, but those people are connected to even sort of more sophisticated science about sort of neural networks and everything. And if any of those links in the chain of trust are broken, you risk a lot. And you know, doctors don't even know the test characteristics of a typical test, and nor could they explain it. So for them to be sort of computer science whiz kids and have the emotional intelligence that we hope we can reclaim when AI is doing more work for us, I think is unrealistic. But I agree that we've got to try to move in that direction because the technologies are already out in front of us.
Great. Roz, did you have anything to add to that before we turn to audience questions?
Just very briefly, that I encourage people to don't just stop at accuracy rates. Go ask what kinds of data was it trained and tested on, and what kinds of errors does it make? And I think that's helpful for getting a little bit of sort of input output and level understanding without having to know all the details of what's going on inside.
Great.
Can I make one more comment?
Oh,
about
yes,
trust?
yes, please.
I love to talk about trust. A colleague and I wrote a paper about trust in AI probably a year or two ago. And really, I think that it represents the way in which we can either flatten or distort the use of words. So trust goes way back in medicine, and it means a particular thing, and it means something related to human relationships. And even applying the word trust in its most robust sense to human machine relationships, in some ways is either a category error or a flattening of the full robust meaning of the term. And that kind of sort of potential for distortion is the kind of thing that when we get swept along by the sort of the excitement about what a technology can do without looking under the hood, as you say, we tend to, our vocabulary implicitly drifts before we realize what we've done. And then we conflate the full orbed meaning of trust with like reproducibility. Well, there's a lot more to trust than just reproducibility. There's this idea of entrustment. And nobody would say that we should entrust ourselves to a machine. And yet, when we start using the word, there we go, right? So just a point about sort of the lexicon of popular life, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for that. I had never considered that before, so I really appreciate you bringing up that. I'll be more careful about how I use that word in the future. We're going to turn now to questions from the audience. As we are taking these, please feel free to continue to add your questions or to upvote questions that you would like to be asked. And I'm going to just take a minute here to look through these questions. So there are a couple questions here that are related to the workforce, and so I'm just going to combine a couple here. So do you guys have any thoughts about whether or not AI will be replacing the workforce the physician workforce, e.g. will AI replace doctors, and would there be any particular areas of medicines that might be relegated to AI to a greater degree or a nearer timeline than others? For example, radiology diagnosis.
Well, that's an interesting question because I spent, I don't know, a year and a half or more with the UK. The NHS commissioned me to oversee a team of about 50 people in the UK about their workforce and the future of AI and its influence and other, digital technologies. And we came to the conclusion that no, this would not reduce the workforce. There's no physician, clinician that's going to be replaced. And you can read the report. It's a pretty, it's a succinct report, but it's got a lot of, I think, supportive data and evidence in it. But what we can see is a reduction in growth of the clinicians, because right now we have unchecked growth in many countries. This is the only area of employment, healthcare workforce that's growing out of proportion to everything else. And so while we like to stimulate jobs, we're overcooked here because that's what leads to the profound expense in healthcare. It's a labor force story. So we want to use AI to basically do a lot of back office functions, the coding and billing and a lot of stuff like that's not frontline medicine. And then the term you use about leaning on machines, yes, because we can reduce the reliance, the full reliance of clinicians. So I guess the answer to that question is, will there be a long-term workforce influence? Yes. For example, if you get rid of keyboards, what we call keyboard liberation, which is one of the most important short-term needs, that AI can get us there. I'm confident of that. But that will just redeploy clinicians to do what they want to do, which is take care of patients, which is why they went into medicine in the first place. So you see this kind of shunting to better activities, but not the net reduction of the need for the talent and the people.
There's another question here that I'd love to hear all of your personal perspectives on, which is, I'm curious about the idea of healing, be it physical, spiritual, or emotional and more. What do you think is the role of AI in all of these spheres?
I can tackle that first, I guess. My biased perspective, which I probably should have come out with beforehand, is I'm a white male Protestant Christian physician. And I think medicine matters for a variety of reasons. But to me, it matters most deeply because I think it's mirroring greater realities related to kind of relationality that's deep in the nature of things. And that to the extent that we accompany and console our neighbor in a finite human journey, we ourselves become more united with the deep nature of things. And I don't ever want to outsource that, because as soon as I do, I lose something in my own becoming. And I hope that the path of AI helping medicine is not the same path as the electric laundry washer or the toaster, which was the marketed hope of having free time to do all sorts of amazing things, but then just cramming our lives full with more technological preoccupation and allowing our neighbors and our friends and our family to die alone in the ICU in the case of COVID.
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
I don't.
It's a huge question.
I'm optimistic about a lot of things with AI, but I'm not. I'm sort of grasping to come up with examples where it's actually been healing. It's very easy to come up with examples where it drives us nuts, where it's very frustrating, where, it just does catastrophically stupid things. And, we worry about those things, right? So I still think the safest thing is to couple it with a smart human and look for ways it can help the smart human, get the load of laundry done, but not falsely promise something that we're not going to have happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's all in the indirects. If you get people to be more autonomous with their health, and you help clinicians not having to, review inordinate amounts of data, where you tee it up for them, and you have time with people, and you're doing the things that you really want, which is, caring for patients. All that are indirects towards the human interactions, the bonds, the presence, the trust. I'll say trust, and I think the empathy. So it isn't a direct; it's a lot of indirects.
Yeah. Thank you. There's another question here that I think Jon might be interested in as our resident ethicist here. Do physicians have an ethical obligation to use an AI-based tool if it has been shown to improve outcomes?
That's a big if, but I think to the extent that providing reliable diagnostic information is part of the job, that's part of the job, but it's just part of the job.
Yeah, I think we're going to see when things become a standard of care, and it isn't being used in an individual, it will be a medical legal precedent. So I'll just to be concrete, I'll give you an example. About half of people with diabetes never get screened for retinopathy, a leading, if not the leading cause of blindness. Now we have deep neural network systems in grocery stores where there's no ophthalmologist, but just basically someone that could have a person get their eyes imaged, the retina, and then get cloud algorithmic interpretation accurately, whether they have diabetic retinopathy, to prevent blindness. Now, as that becomes, routine, and that becomes, something you could do on a smartphone, something that becomes basically of little expense, and someone goes blind because their physician never did it, you'll see a lawsuit, that kind of thing. So when things get validated, that's an example of a prospective, well done validation. We don't have that many of those, by the way. There's about 12. Then we'll start to see, as it gets, basically embedded in medical care, there'll be challenges about, why didn't I get that care? Why did I get a wrong diagnosis of my scan that led to this unnecessary operation kind of stuff? So we're still early, but when things get really well validated and change practice, that is standard of care, that's when you start to see the questions come up.
Jon, were you going to add something?
I guess part of to me, the challenge of sort of racing ahead with AI is it sort of, in some ways, obfuscates us from fixing the problems of the present. And puts our hope and attention and energies elsewhere. So I think there's this fundamental irony, which is we're asking human beings to become more robotic while we're trying to humanize machines. And we're not really fixing that problem. We're actually outsourcing in a broken system things that we haven't fixed. And I think Eric's a little bit more optimistic than I am that we'll get to the point where we can reclaim that sort of humanizing part of medicine with an incremental add of AI on top of industrialized medicine. I would say forever, it's like COVID, right? If we had spent 1/10 the dollars on national security that we had spent on public health infrastructure, we'd be in a different place today. If we spent 1/10 of our energy and attention in dollars on humanizing healthcare instead of improving AI analytics for healthcare, I think we'd be in a different place. We don't have a chief empathy officer at Mayo Clinic, but we have a president and CEO of the Mayo Clinic data platform. and that tells you what's important. And unfortunately, I think it becomes a distraction and it keeps us from fixing our other problems.
I'd like to comment on that because I think this is really quite important. The medical profession has not ever stood up for patients in itself. It has no representation. Basically, it's represented by trade guilds like the American Medical Association and all these other societies. And so, you know, I wrote a piece in the New Yorker, now it's not quite a couple of years ago. And basically what it's about is that this became a big business because we let it happen. We never stood up. We never had solidarity or representation. These trade guilds, all they care about is, you know, maintaining reimbursement for their constituents, which is not the issue. So if you have AI in full gear and it's now, you know, the overlords, which are the administrators in health systems, like the ones Jon just referred to, and he has this passive stance that, you know, you can't do anything about it. I have a very different view about that. But if you let it happen, the overlords will say, we'll see more patients now that you have machines to help you, read more slides, read more scans, and on and on. So there needs to be a revolt against that, to use the gift of time for care. That's what has to happen. Otherwise, the default mode is it will get worse, if that's even possible. We have a global clinician burnout. We have the highest levels of depression and suicide in the history of the medical profession. And if we don't stand up for patients and for restoring the humanity in medicine, then we get what we deserve, and our patients get what they don't deserve. So that's why it's time to not be passive anymore. And that's something we have to, you know, the idea that we just let the overlords continue to rule the roost, that time is past.
That was great. I think you guys should write a joint manifesto.
The preacher has preached.
Well, thanks for articulating that, because yeah, I've been hearing this from all friends who are physicians also, that it's just a huge and growing problem even before the pandemic. And I think the stresses of everything recently has only made it worse. And it's great when a leader like you speaks out and says what you just said. I think we need to figure out how to convert that into the change. And then the ideal that people dream of needs to be articulated. And then we need to be building that future and optimizing for that. Anything's optimal given the right criteria. There's this problem of what are the criteria? And if the criteria is real one-on-one human time together, physician and patient, and that's what's most healing, then, we need to optimize for that.
Absolutely. I nominate Dr. Tilburt for Chief Empathy Officer. We should start a campaign. I'm just keeping an eye on time here. We'll probably have time just for a few more questions. So I'm just going to quickly look through here, and don't want to make sure that we have the most recent ones as well. There's some questions here, which I'm just combining some questions, which relate to particular populations. So for example, one was about, what is your opinion on using multi-competent robots in elder care? And someone else who asked about a patient with stage 4 lung cancer, how would AI address care? And I'm just curious, as you think about particular populations that you have either worked with or Roz, in your case, created for, are there particularly vulnerable populations or special populations where you think AI has a particularly good opportunity to work with, or conversely, where you would say this is the time for AI to back away from?
I don't think there's a simple answer for even a whole population or type of people. I got started doing a lot of the work we're doing now. I got started working with people on the autism spectrum, and many of them came to us seeking technology that they could wear or use to augment their abilities to read the emotions of others, interestingly, right? To interpret your facial expressions while you were simultaneously talking. They were overloaded by the 10,000 different patterns that were, assaulting their visual system. And they wanted help with that. In a population like that, to help them connect to their physician, if you will, this could be useful. However, to just none of them were actually seeking to replace people, though, with this technology, although many of them love to interact with robots. So we keep finding there are these sweet spots where it's helpful. Many of us I know who have elderly loved ones that we haven't been able to access because they're in a care facility during this pandemic. I don't know if anybody else has, but I kind of wished I could have had some big fluffy thing, give my mom a hug, right? I give her this virtual hug over Zoom. Mom, I'm giving you a big hug and squeeze now. Close your eyes. Can you feel it? It's not the same thing as being there. We have to be creative. If a robot just walked up and did that, even with a person with memory stuff, it's just not the same, right? We know that. And yet, just like telehealth has replaced a lot of face-to-face now, I don't think it's as good, but it has some advantages, right? It has some features. So I think we just need to be very creative about looking for where the technology can help, but not seeing it as this evolution of humans are going to turn into machines and that's going to make a better future. I do not buy that one.
Yeah, one thing that the remote monitoring movement and the robots for the elderly has reminded us is how alone together we are, and how challenged our society is in terms of community and fragmentation. And so long as those remote monitoring devices and the robot in the elderly living room remind us of the painful imperfection of our present, that they're a Band-Aid, they're not permanent healing, then maybe they're a good reminder to us. I've been working some with Native American communities, trying to facilitate care and improving our care in making Mayo Clinic more hospitable and less overtly cold and white to those in our area in Arizona. And I think if we said we want to do a chatbot enabled telemedicine, virtual AI infused whatever with your community, that would be prudentially unwise. And it's not because Native people are categorically opposed to technology, and it's not because it wouldn't eventually benefit them, but there's just too much history there to lead with that. So I think it's much more of a prudential question in terms of where we are in the present than it's some sort of categorical absolute.
Yeah. Thanks for that example. That's helpful. There's a question here about liability. So it says one of the biggest hurdles to AI, be it self-driving cars, facial recognition, et cetera, is being implemented is the liability question. How would that need to change? And I guess this is, liability either for, a medical group or a hospital, or even individual doctors here. I guess another way of saying this, one of you guys mentioned oversight earlier. I'd be curious what you guys think about the role of the FDA as well, or other sort of oversight bodies.
Well, we have some problems with the FDA because they have essentially a conduit for the companies to put forth proprietary algorithms that aren't published to the medical community. And then they give them approvals. Usually they're so-called, 510Ks, which are not the ultimate validation. They're just basically retrospective data sets, which most AI work has been done on. And so they get it out there. And all these, for example, radiology algorithms that are out now, and the medical community doesn't even know the data. They haven't seen it. And, the FDA has done their job supposedly, which to get it approved, and it's really unfortunate. There's this lack of open science, and so we have a real chasm between what is the regulatory science and what the medical community needs to feel comfortable to have that oversight. So one thing, as you earlier got to, is understanding, neural networks. Another is the one that you're implementing in your health system to care for patients, and you don't even have an ability to get to it.
I'm in agreement. We need a lot more transparency around the data as well as the algorithms, because if it was trained on something very different than what you're actually going to be running it on, and it usually is, right? Then the generalization errors when it's tested in the future could be quite bizarre and surprising to people who thought they understood what was going on. And that's dangerous. That's worrisome. I think there need to be these safeguards built in. And it depends how risky the decisions are made on it, how much of that we need.
What about the question of liability? Like I'm out of my depth here because I'm more used to reporting on drugs, but I think, there's sort of really clear sort of labels that come on drugs where, this is what you can use this on, but I don't know how it works with sort of an algorithm, like you said, is the hospital responsible if they then apply it to a set of patients that was not what it was tested on? If the company wasn't clear enough, what happens then?
I'm not sure you have the perfect experts in the room on this. I think we all agree that there may not be the right transparent regulatory sort of mechanisms to help us establish that chain of trust that society would need to really rely heavily on AI the way we anticipate we might want to. I also think that my understanding is that AI might put lawyers out of business, so I'm not exactly sure who I would consult if it were the reliability of AI itself that we were there's something really kind of circular there, so I'm not really sure. But they're important questions. It just seems like it's one additional question about getting the means as sort of transparent as possible.
Yeah, there's another. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, just to add that you can't ever let your guard down. So let's say you have, which we don't have, a grand validation. It's gotten through randomized trials. I'll give you an example. There's been several randomized trials of colonoscopy, with machine vision. So it picks up the polyps much better than the gastroenterologist could. Who would ever thought the gastroenterologist would be leading the charge in AI? But they have for randomized trials. Most of them have been done in China. But the point here is that you use the algorithm, you implement it, you put it across all the health system, and then what happens? There's potential for adversarial attacks. There's a chance that there could be just a glitch in software. So you can't ever let your guard down. No one has really talked about this post-implementation phase, but it is yet another dimension of the uncertainty that we have to keep in mind.
As each of you are thinking about the next 10 years, as you are working on either as a clinician, on the products you're working on, Roz, or on your research, there's a question here, which is, I'd love to hear how your faith or worldview informs or enhances your work. And I would love, I know that's a huge, huge question here, but I would really love to hear how this is, how your faith or your worldview is going to be guiding you as you move forward, let's say for the next decade in this field. Who wants to take that first?
Well, that's a big question, Caroline, and not surprising coming from you. But
well, it's coming from the audience here.
Oh, right. You, I should say. Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm in clinic each week. You know, I spend a day in clinic each week, and that's what is my chance to be in touch with what the unmet needs of patients. And you know, I think that helps me in the years ahead to find out how so many of them want to be more in charge and autonomous. And I think we can get them there. And I think we'll get the virtual health coach that gets all their data. It isn't for everyone, but it's for a majority of people that would want that function to help basically coach them to better health or preventing illnesses that they otherwise might get. So, you know, I'm seeing that in the years ahead, we will get there. It doesn't get there just from deep learning. We need hybrid models to get there. So it's a challenge even for AI scientists to find the path to do that. It works like Roz's work, you know, in one dimension. If you want to understand, you know, a seizure or maybe a diabetes, a sensor, but to do it all, the holistic view of a person with all the relevant data and all the different layers of data, we are a ways to go. But I'm excited about that because if people, when people go to see a clinician, it's a ice pick view of their, it's not the real world. It's for minutes or even an hour, whatever it is. It's not their real. You don't get a high frequency or continuous sample of relevant metrics. So I'm hoping that medicine will change in that way. It all relies on massive data per individual, and interpreting that it's a big challenge. But I'm confident someday we will get there, and that will be a segue to a much more accurate, individualized medical approach, and far less of the mistakes, which hasn't been emphasized yet today. But there's a very high, 5 million serious diagnostic errors a year in the United States, at least, which is, an enormous number of serious errors. So we've got to stop that stuff. We can do better than that.
I seem to be consistently working on problems that relate to people with stigmatized conditions. Recently, a doctor came to me and said, could we help build an AI that helps people to be aware of how empathetic they do or don't look, the medical students and the physicians, when they're interacting in particular with patients who have substance abuse situations. He said that in his experience, these patients don't tend to be treated with as much respect. They're stigmatized. The doctor at the end of the day is like, why would I want to, hear how you're hurting yourself right now? And so while that's certainly not true of everybody, there are disparities. And what I see in epilepsy is a lot of stigma. What I see in autism has gotten better, but there's so many conditions where it's not good. And I grew up as an atheist. I, over time, embraced belief in God and then eventually became a Christian. And one of the things that changed in me was a view of other people as all of us equal, all of us equal, all of us made in the image of God, which was kind of hard for me to grasp at the beginning, but it was a great equalizer. It was a very powerful equalizer. The smartest, most accomplished, most educated, coolest, whatever, was on par with the one who was stigmatized or picked on at school or whatever. And I didn't realize how profound this was until I was speaking in Beijing to a group of people, and I was talking about our autism work and our epilepsy work and all the cool things it's led us to learn about the brain and what a privilege it's been. And one of them said, "How can you say that? How can you work on that?" And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, and the translator was helping me, like, am I misunderstanding something here? And this person had a different worldview, and their worldview was from their religion that these people with these diseases were being punished in this life for something they had done in a previous life. Now, this was a person at the top university in Beijing at Tsinghua, and they called themselves the MIT of China. And they were quite sincere that their worldview was that some people with certain diseases are not as, they are rightfully being punished for something that makes them inferior. And therefore, we shouldn't even waste our time helping them. So this was just shocking to me. And I realized this is a worldview choice. It's a worldview perspective. And, the Christian worldview is very clear, or Judeo-Christian, God, all of us made in the image of God, and all of us equally loved by God. And that has inspired my desire to try to rectify some of those inequities that are out there. Far from achieving it, but it's a goal that I really enjoy trying to work on.
Thank you. Jon, do you want to close us out?
I love the Simon and Garfunkel song, Homeward Bound. I think it's a great encapsulation of the loneliness and longing of the modern secular human soul, and this desire that I just need someone to comfort me. And for me, I think of the C.S. Lewis quote that says something like, hell is being given over to yourself, and the kind of lonely despair of sort of that really sinking emptiness of wondering whether there's nothing else and there's no one else. And for me, both the Simon and Garfunkel song hints at it, and at least the confessions of the tradition that I know the best say that my only comfort in life and in death is that I'm not my own, and that I belong to another, and that that relationality is in the deep nature of things. And for me, that gives me a lot of hope, and hope that the kinds of conversations we had like today can continue.